Good morning. Happy Easter. If you're new here this morning, just a word about how we start our preaching. We'll have a Bible reading. We do a Bible reading, but we usually start with something that is not from the Bible. Today it is a poem by the poet Rosemary Watola Trommer, and it's called "The Question," which she dedicates to June Jordan Kalish, who asked her the question. The question. All day I replay these words. Is this the path to love? Of love? I think of them as I rise, as I wake my children, as I wash dishes, as I drive too close behind the slow blue Subaru. Is this the path of love? Think of these words as I stand in line at the grocery store. Think of them as I sit on the couch with my daughter. Amazing how quickly 6 words become compass, the new lens through which to see myself in the world. I notice what the question is not. Not, is this right? Not, is this wrong? It just longs to know how the action of existence links us to the path of love. And is it this? Is it this? All day I let myself not be too certain of the answer. Is it this? Is this the path of love? I ask as I wait for the next word to come. Then the Bible reading goes like this, comes out of the Gospel of Mark. When the Sabbath was over, this is of course after the crucifixion story, and then it picks up here. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint the body of Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They'd been saying to one another, "Who's going to roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed," which was probably a little too late. All right. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, there is the place that they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee, and that's where you'll see him, just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing because they were afraid. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Or is he? Some of you have heard me tell the story of the Easter when I was getting ready to preach. It was at another church. It was a long time ago. The Sunday school teacher came hollering for me. "Kipp," she said. She came to me with the Bible open, her finger on it. She said, "Kipp." She shoved it in my face. "What happened to the story? Where's the ending? Where's the rest of it?" She had thought that Easter was going to be the easiest Sunday to handle Sunday school, so she hadn't even read ahead. She just figured she knew the story. Unfortunately for her, that year we were reading from Mark. And I don't know if you noticed, but Mark feels a little unfinished. In fact, it feels so unfinished that later copy editors, in the process of putting the Bible together, added not just 1, but 2 additional endings to tack onto it, to make so it felt a little better. A lot of English language Bibles will include one or both of those, like they were there in the original when God handed it down from heaven. But the earliest versions of Mark, the oldest manuscripts of Mark we have, just finish right where we finished. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. You just know that somewhere covered under the dust of history is an ancient version of whatever they used for memes, with a picture of Jesus pointing at the story and saying, "You had one job." It's a strange place to end a story that could change the world. All silence and amazement and terror. And maybe that makes it the most honest ending possible. It leaves us dangling between, yes, terror and amazement, as it says, between utter confusion and holy clarity, between despair and hope, between doubt and faith, between silence and song, between crucifixion and resurrection. But isn't that where we live most of the time? The story meets us where we are, I'm saying, wherever that is, whatever it is that we're carrying with us, whatever mix of things we've got right now, these mixes of desire and anticipation and joy and sorrow, whatever we're living with this morning and carrying with us in the midst of all of these people. And even as it meets us there, we've got to admit, or I've got to admit, that there are things the story doesn't do, whatever its promise and whatever its truth. It doesn't stop grief. Last summer in this space, we mourned the death of a young trans person who had been a part of this congregation. In January, one of my closest friends died at the age of 52 after 10 grueling months of trying everything she could to get the cancer out of her body. The story did not stop either one of them from dying. The story hasn't stopped glaciers from melting. It hasn't stopped climate change or the flow of refugees trying to escape its effects. It didn't stop at least 21 animal species from being declared extinct in the US last year. The story hasn't stopped starvation and devastation in Gaza. It hasn't kept Russian bombs from falling on power stations and apartment buildings in Ukraine. That stone rolled away doesn't undo the crucifixion business that came before. It highlights it. Are we ready for the hallelujahs yet? The story doesn't even give us a body. Just an absence where the body was, and a directive to go, wait, look, listen, and tell. But maybe that's exactly the source of its power. The Gospels tell the story of a first-century Palestinian Jew living under Roman occupation, a man possessed of a spirit that made people uncomfortable. Made religious leaders uncomfortable because they figured he would draw the wrong kind of attention from the empire. Made the Romans uncomfortable because he thought they might destabilize one of their territories. Made regular people uncomfortable and then disappointed because they thought he would start a revolution, but it turned out to be a revolution of justice and love, a nonviolent one. The empire killed him. Brutally and publicly. Crucifixion was meant to dehumanize and to demoralize. It was both a method and a message. It said that the power of the empire was the power of death. In Mark's story, Jesus got swallowed by the power of death, which means that everywhere the power of death asserts itself and everywhere injustice makes it visible, he's crucified again. When migrants die of hunger trying to cross the desert in search of life, Jesus is crucified out there again. When children starve because a government won't let in shipments of food, Jesus is crucified again. When trans and non-binary young people are targeted by lawmakers, and then when the laws they pass normalize and encourage psychological and spiritual violence against those young people, Jesus is crucified again. When communities of color pay the cost for our refusal to deal with and address environmental injustices, Jesus is crucified again. This is a story that this story tells. This is a truth that it tells us. But the story is as insistent as it is unfinished, that the crucifixion is never where the final period goes. There's always something more to come, a comma, a breath, wait for it. There's more. And because this story, Mark's story, doesn't give us a body, but instead gives us an assertion that Christ is risen and somewhere else, it means that he can rise again everywhere the powers of death are stymied, everywhere that love overcomes fear, everywhere that hungry people are fed, unhoused people are sheltered, children are honored, voiceless people are heard. This week, the Philadelphia Inquirer it's an Associated Press story about Dakota Adams, who is 27 years old, and learning that he's good at talking to people, which was not always a given. Dakota Adams' father is Stuart Rhodes, who founded the right-wing group Oath Keepers and is currently serving a prison sentence for sedition. Adams describes his life until adulthood, he says. It was, quote, one continuous gray time of survival and moving boxes, as his dad kept the family, again, quote, in extreme isolation, in one particular cultural bubble, in increasingly paranoid and militant right-wing political spheres, end quote. He, as a young person, had a collection of rifles, body armor, and tactical gear that he used to wear to the anti-government rallies that his dad would take him to. But now he's going around the northwestern corner of Montana, full of militias and anti-government groups, without all of that stuff. Meeting and talking with folks. In that highly conservative area, he's showing up with his long hair, his leather jacket, his eye makeup, and his black fingernail polish to talk to people, trying to get elected to the state legislature as a Democrat. The son of an anti-government terrorist is embracing the principles of democracy. A young man who was raised in fear has converted to openness, authenticity, and courage. Christ is risen. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Calvary Lutheran Church sits just one block away from where George Floyd was murdered by police in 2020. The church and its Sunday school building was built during the Great Depression, and it thrived in the middle of the 20th century. More recently, less so. Just a few years ago, they had reached the point of having $1 million in deferred maintenance to the building. But they wanted to keep the church open, and they wanted to keep operating the food pantry that they had run for decades. They didn't want to close. They needed to repurpose. So they started talking with a nonprofit developer. That developer promised to build apartments that would go to people making 30% the median income or less in the area. So the congregation sold the property. Now they lease the sanctuary on Sunday mornings. They have an upgraded space for their food pantry. And a block away from Minneapolis's shame, the city now has 41 new apartment units that are actually affordable, 15 of them set aside for people with disabilities and people who would be facing homelessness. Christ is risen. In 2010, the trans advocate Rachel Crandall Crocker created the International Transgender Day of Visibility. She wanted a day that would feel something of a counterbalance to the Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is a day that holds a lot of grief. She wanted to celebrate authentic identity and self-understanding without compromising the Day of Remembrance, which is in November. So she chose March 31st, which means we're living today in a convergence. It turns out that the Day of Visibility is more complicated than she thought, to the point where she says she's not totally sure she'd do it all over again if she had to, because any kind of visibility can also bring attacks. But she says that the flip side of that, this is her quote, is the fact that hundreds of people have told me that Visibility Day is the most important day for them all year, and that by creating this, I have saved their lives. And somewhere, thanks to the courage of someone choosing visibility, someone else will live into their new names, their new name, their new pronouns, their true self. Christ is risen. A person in this church is on the verge of celebrating 8 years of sobriety. Christ is risen. This spring, the churchyard will host for the third, maybe the fourth time, a group that does outdoor pet therapy for trans and non-binary young people. Christ is risen. Someone here has been burned by love and decided yet to try it again. Christ is risen. Someone has been hurt deeply and yet decided that they're going to open themselves up and forgive. Christ is risen. In some unknowable combination, this body will hold joy and grief and pain and celebration in some unknown combination, but however it comes, we are going to hold it together. Christ is risen. We live in the in-between. It's always the in-between. The powers of death and injustice, of greed and hatred, of violence and exploitation are at work in this world just as they were at work in the ancient world. If we are anxious and afraid, there's good reason for that. If we hold marginalized identities, there's even more reason for that. But the story, this unfinished story, would have us stay open to the possibilities of otherwise. How do we get there? It's a question that doesn't always have a simple answer, like a gospel that doesn't offer an easy ending. And can we get the image back up? There might be a hint in that image that's on the front of your bulletins, folks on Zoom, that's on the screen. For the second year in a row, our Easter artwork comes from Kyoko Makino's mother, Miyako, in Japan. Kyoko's with us again on Japan time. Happy Easter, Kyoko, and thank you to your mom for sharing her artwork again. This image suggests to me, this is just my interpretation, it suggests motion. And when I look at it, I see the motion of rising. The title is Work. How do we get there? To the world that is impregnated with the Christ who rises. We work toward it. We live toward it. It is what is embedded in Rosemary Traumer's poem, the idea that there is a path of love, but we've got to keep our eyes peeled for it. We've got to let it rise through our bones, through our brains, through our muscles and our actions to become real in this world. The gospel says it as an assertion that Jesus has risen. It gives no proof of presence except for an absence in the tomb, a hole in the rock that poses the question to us, how will you live? What happened to the ending? Where's the rest of the story? The Sunday school teacher was at least a little bit panicked and was definitely a lot confused. But I'm convinced that if we had stood there that morning, we'd stood there and been still and quiet enough in that moment, we would have heard Mark whispering down through the centuries about that non-ending ending. Go in your time, in your place, with your life. Go write it. This is God's good news. Amen.